13 Play it again, Sane. In the Dog Boys managed dance club above, all hell had broken loose. A mad scramble for the doors was threatening to become a stampede. Voices yelled and screamed like the cacophony from some Pompeian evening, running blindly, hysterically waving their hands in the air. They cared only about escaping with their lives. Well-dressed waitstaff was attempting to herd everyone out of the exits in an orderly manner in vain. The funky disco beat had not been shut off, and the colored glass of the floor continued to change and blink to the rhythm. But rather than cutting loose and cutting a rug, the only cutting that was happening was of former allies cutting one another off in their race to escape the out-of-this-world monstrosity which had busted clear through a wall, left a trail of caustic green slime, and now planted itself plant-like in the center of the dance floor. Phil rushed up the stairs and navigated with some difficulty through the frantic, opposite direction moving crowd, Drip Dry eyes close behind him. Soon they were alone near the center of the huge dance floor, the colored glass still shifting and blinking to a chugging beat. But what they studied with dread was hardly groovy in the conventional sense. Its oily green bulk extended behind it like some Pleistocene caterpillar. It was easily the size of a bus, maybe a little bigger. It moved with a torpid shuffling motion. At its front, it reared up in an unwholesome mass of feelers that constantly shook, wriggled, and probed with necrotic energy. From deep within its blasphemous maw, a thin, wretched, alien wailing welled up. "Looks kinda goofy to me," said Drip Dry. "The ghastliest is yet to come," said Phil, not taking his eyes off the now steadily wailing, gyrating entity. "Stand back." The dance record came to an end, emitting a mechanical squeal. The wailing intensified, rising in pitch. The shaking increased in sync. The extra-mundane monstrosity was now racked with such violent convulsions that it seemed it would burst at any moment. Mouth tendrils flailed spastically. The ever-increasing shrillness tunneled its way into the nerve endings of the listener's bones, like a ferret that was being taken apart atom by atom. Drip Dry felt that the dimensions must be cleft asunder, to let loose from liminal planes of existence a swarm of bee-like static entities that would spread outward, consuming all sense and decency. His head felt stretched from side to side. Just as it seemed the creature couldn't possibly gyrate more rapidly, a fully formed humanoid figure popped out of its maw and plopped feet first onto the dance floor, followed rapidly by two more. These beings were covered with an afterbirth of green slime. They had the lithe but tough figures of ninjas covered in black bodysuits. Scaly green shells extruded from all over the black forms, like plates of body armor. Their heads possessed a blank darkness where faces should be, yet Drip Dry felt they somehow sensed from these blank spaces, sent clammy psychic feelers pawing outward. He shuddered. Atop their heads were funny little metal top hats. "Watch," said Phil. In unison, the creatures brought their hands up to their hats and pulled, revealing that what had appeared innocent fashion accessories, were actually the hilts of crystal-sharp ninjutsu which had been sheathed in their very heads. But were sheathed no longer, the things gripped their weapons and assumed the crouching combat stance of the shinobi. "These are the Tortuga," Phil explained. Next, all was razor-sharp action as the adversaries lunged with genetic agility. Phil brought a warhammer out of his substantial utility belt, and set to parrying his foes' attacks. The other two, sensing the larger threat, immediately double-teamed the weaponless Drip Dry eyes. The fast motion on the dance floor set the suavest rump shakers to shame. Phil counter-knocked the swipes of the ninjutsu until pieces of blade were flaking off, falling to the ground. In desperation, the Tortuga held its arm plating in front of its face as it backed up. Phil simply slammed his hammer with precision into every gap in the plating. The arms, now dripping green goo, hung down limp and useless. Phil pounded a John Henry-esque blow to the head, flattening it like a squashed marshmallow and causing the creature to collapse. Simultaneously, Drip Dry was dodging the devilish thrusts of the double team. He deftly grabbed one by the wrist of the hand holding the sword, yanking the arm just in time for its compatriot to accidentally cut through his crony at the elbow. Taking the sword, Drip Dry slammed its blade into the blade of the other in a parry so forceful that both blades shattered. As the armless aggressor tried to flee, Drip Dry dexterously reached down and grabbed its retreating ankle, without taking his eyes off the other opponent. Like a caveman wielding a great club, he swung his victim in a great overhead arc to slam down onto its partner in would-be heinousness. The duo toppled along the floor like 10 pins. As the three victims rolled into a pile and came to an ungainly halt, they began smoking, hissing, and melting into a putrid puddle of green slime, which then seemed to sink into the floor, leaving no trace, no solid proof that they'd ever existed. "That's just a warm-up," warned Philosophy. "Unless I miss my guess, you're about to see what I meant when I said our guest would be instructional. Keep on keeping your distance." Again, the horrid giant caterpillaroid let out its infernal wailing, gave into its miasmal gyrations. This time, some way, somehow, it was even more frantic and intense. Drip Dry thought now it would surely shake loose the surrounding dimensional fabric. He plugged his ears with his fingers and squinted in pain, waiting for his eardrums to burst. Before that could happen, the thing ceased its malarkey, and gave a repeat birthing performance. Again, the entities it spawned from its maw were covered in green slime. This time, on either side was a tall, hairy humanoid creature in a blue sheriff's deputy uniform, with beady, red eyes, 6-inch talons for fingernails, and well-defined muscles. "Those are the deputoids," Phil said, indicating the two oddballs. "Watch out for their fingernails, they're poisoned." In the center was a sight that left Drip Dry aghast. It couldn't be. There, a bit of green slime still dribbling from its chin, was a perfect facsimile of a dog boy lieutenant. Dressed in business casual, the thing had a vacant look in its eye. "It is Casual Friday," it announced to the world in general. "Chillin'." Drip Dry's skin felt it would crawl to the next zip code. But, making believe he possessed the identity of one who hadn't just witnessed what he, in fact, had witnessed, if confronted with such an apparition in a normal setting, particularly once the slime had been cleaned off, what could he think, other than that he was dealing with a slightly off yet fully legitimate dog boys gangster? What would he say in such a hypothetical situation? Oh, no, it can't just be someone with a wooden personality. He must have been birthed from the mouth of a space caterpillar who's out to get me. No. It was a perfect scheme, anyone would have been fooled. The deputies yelped maliciously as they simultaneously leapt at the targets on their respective sides. Phil had to back up rapidly to avoid getting nicked by the talons. He sent his warhammer flying defensively. It was a close thing, but he got a few fingers. Not wanting to take any chances on this tough opponent, he pulled out his revolver and filled the wretch with 6 rounds of silver bullets. At the 6th round, the Fink finally ceased moving and collapsed into a puddle of slime, soon gone from existence entirely. Even amidst his relief, Phil couldn't help feeling that there had to be a better way. Shoot one of these things, and they would just make 10 more of them, while he went through the world's supply of silver bullets. There had to be something other than brute force. Drip Dry continued to snake around the talon strikes of his foes, gracefully dodging the swipes. But these guys were tougher than the Tortuga. From the side, the dogoid declaimed, "Real ca. Very ca." Did it mean very casual? Drip Dry wondered. He couldn't allow himself to be distracted. He took both hands and grabbed the dogoid's midsection, as if he was grabbing a doll. He brought the creature in front of him as a shield. Good and well, but the deputy was not going to be made to accidentally kill his own guy so easily. Still, it gave Drip Dry slightly more breathing room. On the vibrant-colored neon dance floor, Drip Dry noticed, out of the corner of his eye, a shiny object. Looking again, without for a moment allowing his canny opponent to leave his diligent, steely, unwavering, unrelenting, calm, and falcon-like gaze, he realized what it was. In extreme haste to escape, some patron of revelry had let their massive, heavy, shimmering, diamond-encrusted, and frankly tacky wristwatch fall to the floor. Their loss would be Drip Dry's timely gain if he played his cards right. Still using his uncomplaining dogoid shield, he began to position himself, backing up, shuffling a little to the side, backing up some more. Then, with unceremonious speed, he kicked the big heavy wristwatch into a trajectory that sent it slamming right into the deputy's nuts. The deputy, doubling over, clutched his destroyed family jewels. Drip Dry didn't squander the moment. Dashing over with his dogoid burden, he pulled the deputy's arms up and jammed the fingernail talons to the hilt into dogoid's sides. Surprised, the deputy pulled. In vain. Drip Dry had really lodged those fingernails in there good. But he had to act. Smushing the two characters together, he flipped them upside down as if they were cardboard cutouts. Then, he stuck their heads between his impressive leg thews, wrapped his arms around the whole batch of villainy and lifted off. Phil ceased his contemplation. And marveled. The stink of villain fear was in the air. The dogoid was rambling, too much public display of affection bro, no public display of affection bro, too much, gripping his dirty bundle. Drip Dry eyes spun through the air in a squatting posture. And spun. Could this be? Phil knew that it was. He was witnessing a genuine spinning pile driver, a move Mi's and maybe 6 or 7 other wrestlers in the world had mastered. Drip Dry spun. It was clear where his trajectory was taking him. It was madness. They would land right in the middle. Phil began to jog away from the center of the dance floor. The Hadean caterpillar whipped its face tendrils around like on any other day, defiantly calm in its last moments, or maybe just stupid. Drip Dry was heading down, his payload thoroughly dizzy with the eternal centrifugitationality. The sound was like a helicopter of nightmares. And gravity ramped up. Squelch. All was stink and fountainous green as the spinning pile driver slammed into the vile heart of that matron of mayhem, which had lately spawned so many vexing opponents from its maw, and now, would spawn them nevermore. The squelch that evening was archetypal among sounds. It contained the echoes of 1,000 martial squelches. The goo burst forth in hot release, like a massive bog bubble that contained a swamp's worth of nastiness, a swamp that had been waiting eons upon eons for this single instant of nasty rupture. It splashed hither and yon, covering the bright, festive disco flooring with its viridian virulence. No indication of the former existence of deputy, dog, or giant space caterpillar. Nothing but goop remained. At the center stood Drip Dry, eyes, tired, goo-covered, hands on hips, triumphant. "Ah, white, Christ on a crutch," moaned Phil, "think of the cleanup bill." And so it was that I learned something of what I was dealing with. Drip Dry speared the last of his cooling dinner, lapped it off his fork. Barry's noodles had long been consigned to his digestive tract. The Clean Your Plate Club had made a handsome showing at this table. The hour was veering towards late. Waitstaff were roving about the dining room picking up tables for the evening, clinking glass and silverware with expert conspicuousness. Outside, not a soul stirred on the tired old road. The moon being hidden behind fog and clouds, the ocean was invisible in the darkness. "Perhaps we can continue this tomorrow," said Drip Dry. "I'd invite you to crash at my place, but I don't think another roach could fit. If you want refreshment, I recommend the Grande Old Galvanite Inn down the road, just a block to the north. You may have noticed it coming in. That old place is rife with memories, rife with melancholy. But it's a going thing, the most well-maintained in Galvanite, and they don't charge as much as they'd doubtless like to be able to. If you like, meet me on the boardwalk around noon and we can work out some demonstrations. I'm afraid I can't pull off much compensation for those, but with a day's work I should at least get 5 creds out of them for you." "I would be greatly honored," Barry replied. "This is a time, I wager, to rest up and gather intel. If my caravan has gone far, I won't easily overtake them on foot." He reflected that he and his fungus were much to blame for exacerbating this aspect of his predicament. By now the speed mules should be reaching truly heady max speeds, the effects of the Endurine's powder reaching near to its plateau. I'll need funds if it's transport I'm after. But most of all, I'll need information. But I won't bore you with my petty troubles. I should head to the inn and get myself a shower assuming they have vacancy. That's hardly likely to be an issue, Drip Dry reassured. Right. Well, I can hardly stand having to wait for the rest of your scintillating tale. And as for my part of the meal dash. Drip Dry held up a hand. I won't hear of it. Barry paused, a moment of benevolent tension crossing his brow. Well. Under the circumstances, I accept. But know this. There will come a time when it is I who treat you to the better things in life. You may depend on it. He flourished a finger, sending both the men into a fit of hearty laughter. Mountains out of time. The grandiosity of the entryway led on about the grandeur of a previous era. Why had Galvanite ever been a destination? And who were these people who had enough confidence in its future to invest so heavily? But it was just as Drip Dry said. Here, in this one building out of all of Galvanite, things were maintained. And a grande old building it was, the size of a castle, with plain but ambitious deco touches. Barry felt its power of simultaneous attraction-repulsion. It was a pile dedicated to the obscure god of this old town. Mountains out of time. He entered the lobby. A regal grande piano stood to one side. It was set affront a long velvet curtain draped from the high rafters, dripping in languid clumps onto the floor. Fresh rose petals were scattered about atop the handsome black lid. For such an instrument to be in such a town it was like a supernatural sighting. The lobby was now quiet. It was late and getting later. The time to see about accommodations, to ensure one wouldn't be spending the night out on the beach, there to suffer the risk of being rolled for change by hoodlums and junkies, was at hand. But he couldn't take his eyes off the incredible instrument. And as he pored over the fine language of its surfaces, of its grande design, and stepped closer, getting a good view of the keys, the magic didn't diminish. It stayed strong and magical and musical, and put a taste on the air that he could just hear, almost as if it were right there, a bit of music lingering, that could still be heard. Music from long ago. And the visions came pouring, clear and fast. Mountains out of time. In the far-forgotten past, industrial developments restructured the way people worked and played. He flew over a primitive landscape. Galvanite had been the most important harbor in the region. Mighty men built mighty empires of commerce, while at home, the wife made sure there was a turkey roasting in the oven at all times. They knew how to drink heartily, in those days. Big men in big suits putting down big stakes and having big heart attacks, while the wife at home turned to booze and painkillers and wondered where it had all gone wrong. A new century dawned. It was the age of greed and desolation, time of the hungry ghosts. Lumpen proletariat roamed the land. Oh! Those vagabonds, drifters who think only of themselves, scum of the social strata lumpen proletariat were making the scene. But not here. Not in Galvanite. Workspace and leisure space were now separated. Families climbed in their chugging vehicles to drive, on merry holiday weekends, to area amusements. Oh, how they lived the good life. We must never allow progress to cease, men. And the pleasure seekers returned with tales of a luxurious climate. Galvanized. They were galvanized by the oceanic mists. Was it in their heads? But this is what pleasure seekers believed. Who are we to be skeptical? Enter the great arid inland. See the towering, stinking metropolis. This was where hungry ghosts toiled, day by day, in an endless procession of days. We must never let the progress slacken. And the air was unbreathable. Now, see Galvanite? That spot by the ocean, the first time little Billy knew what it was like to breathe clean air. See the fair youths fill their lungs and smile, smile with the joy of easy breathing, the joy of easy living. Of clean living. Oh, this was what it was all about. This was progress. Lumpenproletariat, those scum. Keep them out. Our daughters will enjoy it here. The wealthy built fine homes, to rush here as soon as the poppycock at the workspace was done with, and enjoy the clean living. You were really doing well to have a place in Galvanite. The shops in the town prospered, were made quaint and frilly to suit tastes. Aristocratic, but down to earth. Now that's class. The grandest spa was built, the grandest ballroom. They came in fine evening uniform, those on the peak of life. And they mingled, and they hobnobbed. And they danced. Everybody was dancing, dancing, dancing in the moonlight. And the Steinway played. Oh brother, did it play? Mountains, mountains, mountains out of time. Galvanite was chugging along like one of the handsome old vehicles. The vehicles became different. For a time, they were unhandsome. And the hungry ghosts grew hungrier, ever hungrier, and those mean lumpen proletariat continued to multiply. They stank. And still progress marched forward. The promise of a bright future, brought by progress. We've just got to get over the hump. Always, one more hump. But look at the new destinations. There were more places to go to than ever before. There had to be. Working these hours under these conditions, oh brother, you better have better than just Galvanite. So the range of travel options expanded. And the market became competitive. Oh, it became so wonderfully, wonderfully, horribly competitive. Want luxury? Depravity. Culture. There was a top destination and several affordable runners-up for every option. You could travel to all of them using new powerful forms of locomotion. And something startling was discovered. Galvanite had proclaimed the benefits of its life-giving air from the mountain tops, crowning itself the spa location to end all spa locations. Yet when the people of the great metropolis on the arid plains began to investigate other destinations known for their climate, they found that not a one of them had air less beneficial to the body than that found in Galvanite. In fact, most of them had better. But what did that matter? Could any of these highfalutin resorts claim the convenience of location of Galvanite? Besides, the lovely homes which the wealthy had put up, were a sight to behold in their own right. Every now and then, some worrywart ninny hammer would make noise about hurricane danger. Folks find the darndest things to worry over. Apparently the erosion of dunes by development, blah blah blah, some other town somewhere had got a hurricane, blah blah blah. What it amounted to was that they were wetting their bed thinking of a great big storm and wanted the taxpayers to foot the bill for a great seawall to protect the city. Blah. Patently ridiculous. Every storm that Galvanite had faced, it had repelled with ease. And what would some ugly wall do to property values? One had to chortle at the thought, it was just not done. And the Steinway played on. Mountains out of time. It was the dog days of summer. Out in the ocean, the first storm of hurricane season was brewing. A tropical cyclone, it began moving west-northwest with no great signs of ambition. It moved lazily over the great twinkling tropical islands as a mere tropical storm, seeming to yawn as it even lost momentum. The flooding was horrible. The winds, not so much. When it came out the other side of the island chains, it was facing the great United States. It's hard to say when. Something changed in its demeanor, or why. It became galvanized, by what obscure impulse, who can say? It picked up wind. Oh, brother, did it pick up wind? Galvanite. A grey morning. Elegant dandies and Tartuffe Rouse ladies had brought tables out to the quay. Sipping coffee and tea, they fell to gossiping on current affairs. The wind picked up. Shall we go? A gentleman asked. Certainly, another proclaimed. And one by one, the gentry was snatched up by the wind and thrown into the obscuring grey mist, along with their tables and tablecloths, sugar and spoons, coffee and cream, lemon and tea, without being given time to utter a single yell, never to be heard from again. The winds struck without mercy. They struck as the fist of judgment. All unawares, the citizenry woke up to Armageddon. The forces of nature spared no thought for rich or poor, young or old, man, woman or child, all perished. The devastation. Whole blocks were leveled. Many grande buildings were lost, along with the grande souls who happened to reside in them at the time. Still the merciless wind howled, pulling apart everything in its path, drowning what it left behind. Finally, it left galvanite behind, and silence reigned, silence only broken by the wailing of lamentation. The grande old inn, built like a castle, withstood the worst of it. The spa and ballroom were not so lucky. The boardwalk, a cheap thing, could be easily replaced, it was just splinters in the wind. But to replace the spa and ballroom, symbols of a golden age. Who would replace the lives lost? Anguished souls, torn from loved ones, cried out on the wind. They cried in their multitudes. It was the gravest natural disaster the nation would ever know. Wealthy investors fled from Galveston as from a plague. The exquisite houses that survived now stood empty, abandoned. Betrayed. Betrayed. No more future? Still, the Steinway played on. 14 Moon Fruits Boogie. Barry pulled himself from the piano, as the visions ebbed only temporarily, he detected. A sleepy-eyed attendant waited patiently at the front desk. He got an affordable second-story room without difficulty. Still feeling the benefits of the hearty dinner, he shambled up and drew himself a warm bubble bath. He realized, as he floated blissfully in the suds, that he did miss his alchemical equipment. What an alchemy nerd he was! And what a shallow attachment to the hermetic arts one could develop, if one merely took interest in the outer, physical aspects. But doggone it, he couldn't help it if fooling around with equipment was fun. He dried himself off, took a sip of mineral water, and looked out the window towards the ocean. Still, there was no moonlight. Still, the water was invisible, and this far from the breakers, nothing of the waves could be heard. He lay down to the long-awaited ultra-luxury of a real bed. And he could see them. Almost immediately, he could see them. High in the moonlit air, their figures glowed blue and transparent. They were dressed in their finest. Floating on air, for all eternity they would be dancing, dressed in their finest. He got close to them, in that high, thrilling air, with the moon shimmering ocean so far below, sparkles on the black that invited one to this new world. He got close. And he looked into their faces. Ah mama! He looked into their faces, demure, effulgent, transparent, wispy, ethereal, blue, and bluer yet. And blue. And it was black night, bright stars, bright moon, bright moon reflecting on the waves so far below. High air, big moon right up there towering over all, and you could see that this world was impossibly different. Because the moon was too huge, too bright, it was a brightness and a boldness you don't know about until you floated on high currents of deep true night, and you got there. You got to where that moon was, shining, a monument, and the waters, rippling, black, inky black, with that bright moon ripple light on them, so far below, so close to the heart. That moon, so distant, so massive, so close to the heart. Those stars, cold, celestial, keeping watch in the heavens, presiding. Like the time before. In the early days, it was the moon and the stars that presided. Now, it was plain to Barry. They presided in the beginning, and they would preside again. Through millennia, Barry saw patience. Patience. This world was not the exotic. This world was not the outer. Our world was the historic outlier, the curiosity. This world, this was the norm. This was no mere escape. This was the central. And when Barry knew it, he knew also, that the knowledge of it could not leave him, for as long as he possessed a cohesive mentizing apparatus. So he looked, without fear or hesitation, floating on air, into the faces of those dancers. He looked. He looked. The dancers looked back. Did they see? Did they know? There was a blank idiocy about their expressions that was transcendentally brilliant. They were beyond, and their joy beyond joy spoke of a feeling ghostly, and more than ghostly. Hungry in life, they hungered no longer. Though they were completely silent, an eternal residue floated about them. Nearest it was possible to translate, it simply said, "Shall we go?" "Certainly." Followed by light, gay laughter. And repeat. For eternity, repeat. For eternity, glow blue and clear. For eternity float. For eternity, 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 for eternity dance. They had lived beside the ocean. The endless conflagration of development and progress was something they had always wanted to be rid of. They had been swept out, past the breakers, far out and up, to oceanic distances. And they had watched. They had watched the world die. And now, they took their eternal partners by the hand, free of jealousy, free of avarice, of any paltry human emotion. They moved out onto the wind which might have whistled, if it were perceivable to corporeal senses without bringing swift bodily extinction. And they circled. They whirled. They twirled. They spun. Ever stately, ever elegant, ever understated, those ghostly cosmic ballroom dances showed an unhurried majesty of pacing and movement that they never could have possessed in life. In life, they were mediocre comfort-loving bureaucratic types with small horizons. Life was something that was from long ago. And Barry looked into their faces, faces grinning and without emotion, cold and uncaring, but utterly beyond malice. And he loved them, and he loved the children of the moon. But most of all, he loved the moon and the world of the moon, for allowing his eyes to be opened, for easing the burden of ignorance that all men and most people in this age of unreason seem to suffer from, this long, too long age of many torments. Barry smiled. And Barry joined them. Barry danced. And everybody was dancing in the moonlight. He awoke to the drab light of a misty morning. For a moment, his mind couldn't cope with the rapidity of changes in his situation. It was too much to keep up with, much less become accustomed to. Downstairs, he ate muesli and tried to pull himself together. He needed, not to mention wanted, to hear the rest of Drip Dry Eye's tale. He needed to get his bearings. And he needed to learn. He knew that he needed to learn. In the streets, there was little activity. Barry strolled. He walked the barren blocks, clearer as the haze was burnt off, little, by the heat of the sun, but never fully sharp, fully distinct. They were blocks that carried a haze of their own. As he traveled further into the lonely neighborhood streets, he saw that his visions were not far off. Here and there really were some regal old mansions. Fenced off and abandoned to habitation, the largest few seemed to be maintained by whatever cult was keeping the town's memories preserved to view, like a rare butterfly preserved in a jar filled with aspic. But this only applied to the very few grandest. For the most, it was just crumbling. 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 As Barry strolled in a southwardly direction, the houses gradually became seedier. On the sidewalk, a solidly built, plain-clothed, rather unassuming harlot with a modest amount of makeup and a shock of curly hair stood idly. Perhaps this denizen was confused. No patrons were likely to be roving this drab region in broad daylight in search of companionship. As he passed, the harlot squatted, revealing a lack of undergarments beneath her longish skirt, and commenced to urinate on the pavement, singing to herself all the while, in humdrum and mediocre tones. The owner of the small neighborhood cafe she was stationed in front of burst through the front door. Barry was out of there before he could see what happened. At least she hadn't done it in the cafe itself this time, anyway. Besides this small excitement, all was silent. Few people stirred. What did they do in Galvanite? Fishing. Textiles. Seashell merchantry? Barry had seen no really excellent seashells along the beach on his hike this way. He turned in the direction of the ocean, hoping to come upon a speakeasy in the seemingly looser region of town. Houses gave way to ruined shops, abandoned lots with scraggly tall grass and puddles of standing water. The road reached a dead end. At a moderate distance, the crumbling steeple of an ancient wooden church loomed in the purgatorial late-morning atmosphere. Someone coughed. Barry turned out of idle curiosity. It was a miserable old junkie, all sinew and pettiness, mouldering in some back-alley scumpond. Lumpenproletariat. The world had transformed 1,000 times over since the golden days of Barry's vision. But the lumpen were just the same. Always impenetrably engaged in petty intrigues that lead nowhere, diving headlong into enticements that bring them nothing after the first few moments, nothing but sorrow. Dead ends? Dead roads. He came to the facade of the old church. Up close, it was even more dilapidated and miserable. The teal paint was faded where it hadn't dripped off entirely. Wooden splinters stuck out at odd places, showing the violent effects of the dangerous galvanite winds. There had never been any special air. There had been special dreams. And it was the honor of some of those dreams, of the dreams of and for the children, that explained the continued existence of a town here. Barry stepped gingerly up the steps to the humble wooden door, and turned the knob. No sooner had he pulled, than the entire church collapsed inward in an avalanche of rotting splinters, leaving nothing to signify it had ever existed save a surprisingly small pile of rubble. Not even a single metal cross, a single glinting shard of colored glass, poked out to reveal anything of individuality. A slight gust of musty dampness puffed out in all direction, then all was quiet as before. "Well, that's what you call one hell of a coincidence," said Barry, pronouncing coincidence ko-inky-dink. He turned. Across from where the church had been was a squat, unappealing dive bar. Barry sighed. He got the feeling he wasn't going to get a much better speakeasy while he was in Galvanite. The people here, whether citizenry or visitor, seemed to be divided neatly into two types: the respectable and respectful members of the cult of memories, who had no use for something like a speakeasy and indeed probably found the idea a trifle repugnant, and the miserable rabble of lumpen proletariat that infested the nation since its dawn, and which were more likely to give out the latest baseless rumor or crackpot theory than any useful intel on current affairs. But there was no point just sulking and skulking about. He had time before his afternoon appointment, time it was senseless to waste. He strode across the dusty road, thrust open the grimy black door, and entered the darkness. A lazy countrified drawl blurted forth from the jukebox, filling the air with suffocating languor. "Crabs in a bucket." Barry could sense it. There was nothing visibly wrong, nothing offensive in the lyrics, malicious on the weary, wary faces of the wrinkled old patrons. The darkness was overdone, but that was simply the style of these would-be honky-tonk type saloons. It didn't even smell all that revolting. Taken at the face value given to it by the five base senses, such a saloon, however dingy, could very well be a favorite haunt of some upstanding working people, site of jollity and relaxation after toil undertaken as much but not more for personal benefit as for the health and welfare of our great nation. It should be an inoffensive corner of good-heart revelry. But Barry had that sixth sense often claimed, and occasionally possessed, by officers of the law. It was impossible to explain how it worked, but it worked. He knew when he was looking at an ordinary, wholesome honky-tonk. What he was looking at was crabs in a bucket. He sauntered up to the dark, dingy bar. The barkeep was polishing a glass. He polished. He had a chin waddle and receding hair. He looked at Barry. Barry looked at him. 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 Their expressions didn't change. He looked at Barry. Barry looked at him. "I'll have a ginseng tea." The barkeep pulled a teacup and some dry ginseng root up from under the counter. He put the cup under the hot water spigot. He pulled the thing to make the hot water come out. He filled the cup up with hot water. He put the dry ginseng in the cup. He slammed the cup down in front of Barry, displacing a good part of the water. He looked at Barry. Barry looked at him. After waiting the proper amount of time, Barry sipped. "This tea tastes like shit," he said. "10 creds," said the barkeep. "I'm taking this to consumer protection." "We don't got consumer protection in this town." "Well, your tea tastes like shit and I'm not paying for it. So you can just deal with that." "Fat man." From out of a corner, a giant, lumpy, big, rotund, sizable, and morbidly obese fat man lumbered with waddling steps. He had hanging side whiskers. His bald head, which he patted often, was shiny. He smiled evil-like. "Yeah, boss. I got this." Barry didn't hesitate. He gave a striding straight jab directly to the big guy's belly button. His blubbery bulk rippled like waves of a large sea. "Aw," he moaned. He passed gas. Several wrinkly old patrons fainted from the vile odor. Next, while the big man was distracted, Barry leapt into the air and did a spinning kick to the guy's head. "Ow. Okay, but you could really hurt someone with that. I mean, concussions are real things, you know. Are you the guy who beat Drip Dry Eyes yesterday?" Barry nodded, impassive. The big man turned to grab a napkin, then, scrounging in his pocket, found a linty old pen. Barry obligingly signed his autograph onto the napkin. "All right. I want both of you out of my establishment. And don't come back." "Understood." The barkeep looked at Barry. Barry looked at him. "Come on," said Barry. "This place is for chumps. Next time, get some proper ginseng." "I'm hungry," said the big man as they walked towards the boardwalk. "2 pieces of advice," said Barry. "First, lose some weight. Second, join the wrestling setup on the boardwalk, down by the sea. You can make money if you're good. Much better than hanging around in bars." "Hey, that's kinda forward. We only just met." "True. But A, you just attacked me even though I didn't do anything to you. And B, I wouldn't say it if it wasn't really good advice. I'm Barry, by the way. Nice to meet you. I'm Part Oilios. When we get to the boardwalk, you down for a chili dog?" "I'll find something. So what's the haps around and about?" "I'm new to Galvanite. New to this whole area actually." "Oh, it's pretty boring. Only news I've heard lately that's worth mentioning is that big Southwestern wrestling tournament that they're putting on in West Pueblo City. All the tough desert tribes should be there. I think in about 2 weeks from now. I don't know, I can't keep track of that kinda stuff." Magnificent, thought Barry. I might be able to make it to West Pueblo City if I cut a straight line. Out loud he asked, "Do remember if it was multi-day?" Pardoilio squinted slightly. "I think it's supposed to go for like almost a week. If you can beat even old out of practice Drip Dry Eyes in a casual match, you should go there. That's tough, bro. I wish I could beat him with one hand tied behind his back." "Well, he might have use for you. We'll just have to ask him. If you get that practice in, you could develop a lot more self-discipline than from just bar brawls." F.O. shizzle. They arrived at the boardwalk entrance. Drip Dry was leaning on a post, loitering. He cocked a brow when he saw the group approach. "Found a new friend, Barry." Barry made the introductions. Drip Dry was clearly trying to be as politely discreet as possible about the twitching of his nostrils. He would be able to pick up a wealth about the newcomer's character without needing to talk. This moment was when things would likely be decided. "Well," said Drip Dry, "I'm hungry. Let's get something quick from the stands over there. I've got a few things to tell Barry about, Pardoilios. You might find you're in over your head, but I'll explain everything eventually." That settled it. If Drip Dry's smell power had determined so quickly and conclusively that Pardoilios could be let in on details, not only from his personal history, but of potentially enormous political consequence, then Pardoilios must have been trustworthy indeed. Healthy normal dogs often seem to have uncanny abilities of character assessment based on smell, though of course, how they respond to the data, depends on the individual dog. But dogs rarely have the self-discipline to hone and perfect this ability. Drip Dry couldn't possess the full range of canine abilities, being a human who simply had a dog's head. But what he lost in instinct and spontaneity, he was able, in the instance of olfactory character assessment, to make up for with meticulous scientific analysis and informed training. His olfactory abilities in this regard were virtually infallible, as every wrestling kid knew. What every experienced alchemist knew, was that this wasn't just something made up for promo stories, some element of kayfabe. It was a genuine ability, with genuine practical benefits. Pardoilios wasted no time getting his foot-long chili cheese dog with fries and a soda pop. Both Barry and Drip Dry got salads from the soy cart, heaped high with spinach, berries, tofu, and edamame. "You guys love that health stuff," Pardoilios observed. "So indeed we do," Drip Dry said. "And you might not have realized, but tofu and fresh edamame is among the most strengthening foodstuffs. This is still not widely known, but one of the most harmful myths propagated within the fitness world is the idea that soybeans cause weakness. In fact, this myth was created by jealous strength trainers to fool gullible youth into overlooking the power of soybean foods. Of course, you shouldn't use too much soy sauce, that's common sense. But as for edamame and tofu, all the most powerful wrestlers consider themselves soy boys, as we like to say." "Wow," said Pardoilios, "thanks for schooling me. Do you think a diet with more soy could help me lose weight? Everything else being equal, and with a careful watch on sodium and fatty oil intake, I think a diet high in tofu and edamame could make you mighty. Join us, Pardoilios. Soy boys will rule the world." He licked up the last bit of tofu and spinach, making less fuss over table manners for such a casual meal than he had at last evening's fine dining establishment. "But now, let me continue with what I was telling Barry the evening before. 15 rebel without a pause. If these breeder worms are spitting out lifelike imposters," said Phil, "at the constant rate I think they are, it's only a matter of time before they destroy my business. That's why I need to destroy them all. But how? Where do they come from? These questions which, I dare to imagine, are now preoccupying your own mind have distracted me for months. They've taken up all my time. Breeder worms dance through my dreams, spitting out Tortuga and deputies and dogoid imposters and all the other many strange and horrible foot soldiers they're capable of producing. They're bad dudes, drippy old boy. But they're not smart enough to act alone. I have no leads. If this keeps up, me and my lieutenants will be driven into hiding." "That looks like where I'm headed to," said Drip Dry. The slime was already seeping into the ground. Soon there would be no sign left that the chaotic breeder worm had ever existed. The floor lights still blinked colorfully within their glass tombs, but no music played. A silence and a stillness had fallen on the dance floor. And Drip Dry thought of how hollow his life had started to seem, even before all this trouble. Had he really ever believed in staying in a marriage that all the magic had gone out of? Had he ever really been concerned with becoming a restaurant magnate? Was his development of a lack of shame at promoting things like toys and doggy biscuits a function of mature perspective and realism, as he so often told himself? Was he really as happy with his motives now as when he started? New motives creep in on us. And when we're young, we don't possess the same complacency about our motives. We grow older, and we tell ourselves stories about youth. No sooner is youth past, than we say things like, "Look at all the energy I had." We blame the laziness of our motives on a lack of energy. Or perhaps it's the weight of responsibility, spinning our personal duties into something much greater than they really are, when we know that if we disappeared tomorrow, those responsibilities would be taken over without difficulty, that there may even be people who would get something out of the tasks that no longer give us anything. But we don't think about that. We can't. Who wants to contemplate disappearing tomorrow, and not being needed? And who wants to acknowledge that the changes for the worse we've taken since youth, might not be due to an immutable advantage in the nature of youth, that it could be shortcoming that, for years, we've avoided addressing, though we would have been perfectly capable of it? Drip Dry looked at the chipped watch lying on the floor, so recently the implement of nut punishment for a goon who no longer existed. What kind of an existence was this? To be spewed into the world, with the function of disappearing rapidly when your use was exhausted? He felt like a murderer. But any remotely significant damage caused the goons to die, and without being damaged, the goons would continue to rampage and would, themselves, take human lives? Could they be restrained? He hated to think it, but better if they were never born. What a cold thought! And yet it was hard to argue with. Life seemed doomed, for such as them, to be worthless suffering. But who could judge that? Who living could be entrusted with that responsibility, could be viewed with confidence of possessing that capacity, the capacity to know what did and didn't constitute a worthwhile existence? This was deep shit. In so many ways, Drip Dry was looking at some deep shit. He shook his head from side to side. Let's break this down. What kind of power structure is equipped to send out units like this? Aw shit man, I don't know. It has to be big enough to have the power, but secretive enough to do all this in stealth. The only organization I can immediately think of like that, is Dog Boys. Are you serious? I thought you were a real dog face. I can barely keep this crummy discotheque solvent. You think the bozos I hire could keep it secret if I had an army of big green caterpillars stashed in the basement? I'm surprised a bookkeeper doesn't just give away all my tax documents. I don't think you did this. You don't have to keep working to convince me. There are easier ways to sell dope dash. Brilliant observation there, Mr. Nobel Prize. Okay, alright, easy does it? All I'm saying is that there has got to be a fairly narrow window. If an organization was too big, it couldn't keep these shenanigans secret for more than a couple of days, and you say you've been dealing with this for months. If it was too small, it couldn't have the resources for all this. Of course, it may be getting help from outside sources. But to even send these guys out constantly would require a well-organized central authority. You really have no leads. No, not even close. And I can't stand thinking about working on this another night alone. Drip Dry sat for a time, his expression unchanging, looking into the middle distance. We made love that evening, he finally said, with a level tone. Drip Dry, Barry said. You don't have to tell us anything personal that you don't want to. I'm sure we can work well together dash. Thank you, Barry. But I think it's important. Even if there's a remote possibility it could be of value, I should give you all the info I can pertaining to the situation. It was the first time I'd been in bed with anybody since the divorce. Pardoilios put a hand to his mouth, then lowered it quickly. We went to his place. I can't explain what chemistry we had. I usually say opposites attracting is a myth, but I guess there's a truth behind every myth. Anyway, the few months we were together, it eased my pain, a little. And it helped us stay focused on researching who could be behind the imposters and the bioterrorism. What did ya find out? Asked Pardoilios. Mainly rumor and innuendo. But after months of digging, we felt like we had a few leads. That's when we decided we were too conspicuous. We would have to go underground and split up. My lawyers came to an amicable agreement, aka I paid those slime ball managers out to leave me alone. It was chump change once they realized how little of a case they would have if they really pursued it. The restaurants were shuttered, the name, put to rest. And Phil headed on the road with his boys. And I headed on the road the other direction. Eventually, I ended up here, in good ol' Galvanite. But obviously you're wondering, why Galvanite? And that, my fine feathered finks, is a story for after we show the good people some demonstration wrestling on the boardwalk. Pardoilios, just watch for today. Get comfortable with the idea of what we're doing. Chew it over in your head. Come on, gang. Let's jump to it. That evening, after a day of standard action for a standard crowd, the trio took their seats at a standard seaside diner. I'm starving, said Pardoilios. Imagine how hungry I am, said Barry. I actually did something. It was nearly as hazy now as it had been yesterday, and the light had faded so quickly that, with the cool breeze coming in from the ocean, it was as if winter was getting a head start. After an eternity of muggy weather, Barry was fine with it. A thought came unbidden into his head. What is T-Town? He filed it. Drip Dry ordered avocado toast. Barry ordered avocado toast. I'll have an avocado toast, Pardoilios said boldly. Drip Dry started right back in. It was a relief to be on the road. Between lawyers and the divorce settlement, I was almost wiped out financially. I was ready to cut my losses. Before I started really getting serious about wrestling, I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. As I improved, I started to feel a real bond with my peers. That's great. But it was more than that. I started to feel like I belonged to the group. And this sounds like a pure positive. But what I've realized since then, is that it's hard to find a group for an honest reason. The more honest a person you are, the more integrity you possess, and there's no possession more valuable, the less likely you'll come across a group of people that you can really point to as my people, as the group you fit perfectly into. Because you have to give in. There's no way you can match the group on everything. Somewhere, sometime, you have to change your opinions to accommodate the group. Change is healthy, it's vital, when it's in the service of growth. But spin it however you like, there's gonna be a point when you're changing just to fit in better with the group. Even if you don't know it at the time. Groupthink is pernicious. First you join the group, and you find that you broadly agree with most, if not all, of the major things the group believes, the big O opinions, that you have to subscribe to, as a prerequisite of even being accepted. This is likely an honest alignment of beliefs, or you wouldn't have been attracted in the first place. But you may hold in reserve the details of your small O opinions, the ones that don't matter quite as much to the group. But there's time. And over time, you shift your views to align with the group on smaller and smaller matters. And eventually, there's no O left. And you're P-one. I was P-one to the groupthink of the wrestling world. I had grown to accept a superficial, hollow lifestyle that I had always seen through, deep down, but that I had seen people I respected, my people, adopt one by one, until almost no big-name wrestler of any note did things any differently. The obvious exception was Jazzy Jayhawk, but he was always his own separate universe. Frequently, some other big name would start in with things like, Jayhawk can't sustain this hype forever. He's got real skill, but his tricks are starting to show. The cracks in his wrestling game will be too obvious soon, or, Jayhawk has had a good run, but it seems like he's running out of tricks. He'll probably not be able to keep up, start taking loses, and have to mainly be marketing his personality within the year. And remember, this was 8-9 years ago. We willed ourselves to believe stuff like this, because deep down, we were insulted that Dr. Jayhawk showed how you could live a better way than ours, and still be at the top of the game. Not coincidentally, whoever it was that was saying that stuff, it was like there was a curse. It was they themselves who would start to slip up and show cracks. So people just stopped saying it, and we didn't talk about him much. But it was never really about Jazzy Jayhawk. It was about us. About our own short-sightedness in life. Now I was seeing new horizons. I hadn't asked for this and wouldn't have wanted it. But it was exhilarating. I was freed, and I hadn't known I was caged. Now I was searching different places where Phil's dog Boy Scouts had seen breeder worm activity. I was still a minor celebrity, hardly an ideal undercover agent. But I would just stop in, do some demonstration wrestling, and get to know the people. Before long I was known as a traveling instructor, an educator. But I was starting to be seen as really past my prime. And the more I went around, the more impossible I found the idea of going back to the industry. So I just kept moving. Finding out what I could. I'm still going, and I'm only in Galvanite until I get another lead. It's a stop along the road. What I've found out, basically all I've really been able to piece together in 8 long years, is that the central government still exists, and they're trying to create a police force. Those dastards, cried Barry. Pardoilios looked puzzled. I thought the central government was just a myth. Would that were the case, said Drip Dry. But they exist, and I've spent harrowing nights confronting the horror of their projects. It has left me a changed man. But I fear it's worse than that. I think there's a real possibility that the central government is such a deep rot in the structure of human society, that it can never be fully eradicated. We can only minimize the damage. Barry ruffled his nose. Sounds like defeatist claptrap. Where there's a will, there's always a way. Drip Dry eyes looked melancholy. I'd like to believe. What do you propose, friend Barry, as a next step? Simple. I propose a deal. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Because in fact, our goals are not dissimilar. If my fungal concentrates can be perfected, they could cure all central government agents of programming. At the potion's current strength, however, there isn't enough fungus in all the forests of the nation for this task. I need to get to Dr. Jayhawk, to discover his secrets of potency, among others, and that's just the beginning of how he can help us. To gain access to him, we should start by forming a tag team. Pardoilios tells of a wrestling event happening soon in West Pueblo City, metropolis of the southwestern lands. Do you think we could make it there in 2 weeks? I know the one you speak of. I'd need a day to pack. But if we left the day after tomorrow, I have no doubt we should make it in time, unless some mishap befell us. I will mull your idea over, sleep on it, and get back to you with stratagems on the morrow. But I like it. It has a good sound. I've done lots of looking. Perhaps, now that I have your help, it's time we tackled the matter head on. We can't kill all the breeder worms. And this isn't a game. Despite the name central government, we can't just go to some central location and beat up our problem there. That's not how history works. To really confront the problem, we need something else. We need to change minds, so that the followers of the central government are able to wrestle free from the control it has on them. And the value of Jayhawk to this enterprise could be inestimable. I feel that his is the voice of destiny, calling to us. But to get to him, we'll need to work hard, and to really wrestle. Wrestle yo problems, muttered Pardoilios reflectively. Yes, that has a nice ring to it, said Barry. That could be our tag team name. Wrestle yo problems. What say yet? I love it, said Drip Dry. Pardoilios, should we decide to go, would you want to accompany us? It could be an invaluable experience. I ain't doing shit here. Count me in. I'll help however I can. Also, this avocado stuff is pretty filling. The three men laughed heartily. Barry was earlier than last night heading down the Arbor Avenue to the Grande Old Inn. He opened the Grande Old front door. There was a small reception of folks in nice clothes, for what occasion, it was impossible to tell. Glasses clinked lightly. And a pianist was seated at the Steinway, tapping away. His music was basic. Evening piano standards. Not overwhelmingly sentimental, but neither was it on the cutting edge of artistic risk-taking. None of that really mattered. Barry had a seat a discreet distance. And listened. Because it didn't matter that the musician wasn't a genius. The piano was. The piano was a musical genius of timeless transcendence. Whoever had played the piano in the golden days, whether they were great musicians or not, had infused and invested the grain of the woodwork, the vibrancy of the strings, the very molecular structure of the keys and pedals, with indelible emotions that accrued a sort of spiritual interest over the ages. Barry closed his eyes, saw the blue vibrations with his third eye. Oh, that jazzed. It jazzed real good. He sat like that for a while. Then the pianist stopped playing. And Barry opened his eyes almost immediately, as it occurred to him how mundane of a fellow this musician really was, how irregular this little group of people really was. And Barry smiled. If you knew what angels lurked in your midst. What angels? He lay down to sleep. And the dreams weren't as quick. But they came. They came. He was high. Darn high. He looked down, and there, well below, were the twirling blue blots of the dancers. Yet farther, the twinkle of the moon on water was visible. He looked up. Now that's what I call moon. Did it loom? You ask. Well. It was a loom and a half. This moon loomed. Now he was getting closer to this moon. And a bright yellow invaded all of space. He saw the crags, the valleys, gaining definition, coming to meet him. The curvature of the moon's circle was getting flatter and flatter, the mountains were sticking out more and more. He must have been going at incredible speed. He realized he couldn't look down any longer. And then, down was up anyway, and he spun and alighted on the very highest mountaintop, towering far above all others. And he wasn't alone. There in front of him stood the utterly nude, hyper-muscled figure of an ancient witch. His third eye left him no doubt that she was a powerful practitioner of the mystic arts, a Wiccan wunderkind who probably had more than a smattering of alchemical knowledge. In fact, he wouldn't be surprised if she were at least as learned as he in alchemy, on top of her probably supreme mastery of witchcraft and proficiency in any number of other arcane studies. And it was hard to imagine her with any clothes on. And you'd be right, she said in a not humorless chronorisp. On all counts. Barry took in her figure. Towering, angular, her form naturally made largely androgynous by the masses of muscles, she was different from drip-dry eyes in that her angular body had all the strength and definition, but little of the aesthetic beauty. Hers had been a building regimen totally unconcerned with creating nice appearance, and indeed the taut angularity and even the sharpness of her corners made her presence more intimidating. Her few strand of hair hung in strings from her shiny cranium, but somehow, in spite of all the factors that would indicate otherwise, she didn't have a combative aura. Her nose was pointy and, by which standards, not overly large. In height, she must have been a long but sturdy 7.5 feet, but her head looked like it would fit on a normal old granny without problem. In all, she was a living expression of individuality, and Barry could only admire. This was one tough witch. You Mirren dearie? Listen real quick, the witch said. You know that woman calling herself Morgo? I'd take what she has to say with a grain of salt. Believe me or don't. Well, be seein' ya before too long. And with that, she vanished in a puff of thin moon smoke.